Um,
There we go. Go ahead.
yeah, I was just wondering if we can go like very quickly over Flexbox again because I was just a bit confused about them and how to use them, especially because it's for the homework due tonight.
Um, yes. So in terms of an actual like coding demo, I can't really I'm not really prepared for that per se. If you have a more specific question, I can try to answer it though.
Yeah,
Um,
okay, no, fine. I'll just try to figure it out.
okay, yeah. The thing about Flexbox is in general, um, just try to like draw out the alignments before you start. Like try to visualize the end product before you start because it can be very confusing, especially if you're nesting Flexboxes. So make sure to organize your thoughts and your approach to it before you try to code it. Because once you get in it, it's really easy to confuse yourself. At least that was my experience. Um, okay, if there are no other questions,
Thank you.
yeah, of course. If there are no other questions, I will go ahead and get started with today. Um, and if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself, and I'll be happy to go over it. All right, let's pull up today's slides. Oh, okay. Can everyone see okay?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. All right, so today we are moving on to JavaScript lecture 2. This is on the DOM, the document object model. The reality is with JavaScript that because we are working with various file formats, you have your HTML page, you have your CSS page, and you have your JavaScript, we need a controlled and consistent way to interface between those things. The DOM solves that problem. The DOM is at the very core, it's how we get JavaScript to talk to HTML. It's how we actually functionalize our websites. So that's like a broad overview of everything. So I will go ahead and jump into it then. So today's agenda is really simple. We're just going to go over the DOM. We're going to go over how to interface with the DOM and the variety of things the DOM can do, how to add events, listeners, and I'll go over what those are as well. And again, if you have any questions, please just interrupt and ask. I don't want anyone getting left behind or discouraged. We got plenty of time, all right? Okay, with that, what is the DOM? So at the very core, the DOM is a data structure. It's a data structure that holds all of our HTML elements. So if you recall to our lecture on HTML, HTML is essentially everything that the browser will render. So everything that the user sees boils down to HTML. In order to change what the user is seeing, fundamentally, we have to change the HTML. The browser is only rendering HTML. So the DOM is an organized way to, the DOM is an organized way to interface with the HTML. And we're to some extent familiar with the DOM. So the tags that you use to actually encase your content, like for example, title or paragraph, let's say here, those are nodes in the DOM tree. So you can see we have text in the DOM tree under title. And from JavaScript, we can access these elements using the tags you assign, as well as other attributes like ID, classes. So everything that HTML can do is accessible by the DOM. And with that kind of power and flexibility, the options for our website are kind of limitless. We can interface with any number of nodes at any time, have them interface with whatever database we're using, interface with whatever cool user things you want to do. Basically, it's this big tree that we manipulate to make it work for us. Okay, that's a broad overview of DOM. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, silence. Sorry, one second. I think somebody tried to come in, but I don't know if I let them in. Okay, yes, I did. All right. Yeah, I see a question in the chat. So you have, oh, sorry. What does it stand for again? It stands for Document Object Model. So the document is basically an object containing all of the attributes. So the document object contains the entire HTML tree in an accessible way. So how many of you know what an object is? Like just by a show of hands, like by reaction. Okay, so for those that don't know what an object is essentially a way in programming that we organize attributes that we want to access later. So the document object model is quite literally an object containing all of our HTML attributes. Does that make sense? Okay, I will take that as a yes and move right along. Alrighty. Hello. Okay, so pop quiz. How are the DOM and JavaScript related? So this is actually more of a concept check, but like I said, the DOM is an object-oriented representation, which is basically just to say the DOM is an object, an organized way for us to access attributes of the web page, of the HTML page, which can be modified with a scripting language like JavaScript. So it's saying it takes the HTML, translates it into an object, and then we can interface with that object directly. Okay, that was a lot of content. Are there any questions? So is the DOM written in JavaScript? It's a little bit complicated, but you can think of it like the HTML is linked to the object. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But Kamal, what is the difference between scripting and programming language? You can think of it like programming languages are like multi-purpose and flexible. Like they serve a variety of purposes and they have certain programming paradigms. Scripting languages are more for specific purposes. So you write scripts knowing that the functionality is contained, but it's effective in the purpose it's trying to achieve. So Mira, I'll come back to your question a little bit. JavaScript is a programming language. It is a fully Turing complete, as we say, programming language. So you can technically do everything you want to do in Python in JavaScript. But the reason we use JavaScript is because it comes with special things, like special features, like the DOM, that make it particularly well suited for web development. And I will go into that now. All right. So to come back to Mira's question of, is the DOM written in JavaScript? You can think of it like this. Basically, JavaScript gives us a variable called document. Document is an object that's already linked to the HTML page in which we have interest. So I can use document without importing it. I can use document anytime I want. I can use document as the API defines it. It's intrinsic to JavaScript that this magical document variable just works. It just contains everything we need. That's one of the main advantages of using JavaScript, is that without that document variable, things get very messy very quickly. So on the document, let's look at this script tag here. As a side note, make sure you put your script tags at the end of your body, otherwise you'll run into a weird behavior. I don't know why it does that, but it does. So just take my word for it. Okay, so we have the document object. From the document, we run this function, get element by ID. What's the ID? Demo. So we're grabbing this element with this ID. Then this is one element in the DOM, and an attribute of that element is inner HTML. Inner HTML basically describes, if you had two tags, inner HTML describes what would be between those tags. So if it's just text, then it'll just render text. If it's a link or a button or whatever it is, that is what is inner HTML. So this is essentially boils down to an object-oriented philosophy. We have our parent object, which contains all elements in our entire HTML page with all IDs and all children. And then using attributes of the main element, we can get specific elements, and then we can get specific attributes of those elements. So this naturally lends itself to an object-oriented structure. Okay. Does that make sense? Are there any questions? Please do not be afraid to ask questions. Oh, sorry. So what are attributes? Attributes are, okay, look at this. You see this paragraph tag? Everything inside the bracket is called an attribute. An attribute is essentially just a property or like something that belongs to something else. So this ID belongs to this specific paragraph tag, this specific tag. Is that clear? We'll see more examples of this as we go on.
Can I also ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So what would be the results of this HTML documents with the hello world? Is the word demo simply replaced by hello world?
No. So to come to this example specifically, actually, yeah, that's a good point. Let's go over this example. So we have our header and our item, right? Do you see how this attribute is inside this bracket? That signals that this is an attribute of the tag. It's part of the tag. You see how it's part of the tag? That is different than what's between the tags. That is the inner HTML. What's between the tags is the inner HTML, and what's inside the tag is the attribute. So these are properties of the tag, and this is the content of the tag. So here, this is saying, okay, in the document, please look for ID with demo. So grab this tag, right? And then in the inner port, please put hello world. So if we were to run this, we would get the content of this tag being hello world. Is that clear?
No,
is that clear?
It's absolutely clear. I see it's part of the tag and this puts it inside the tag. Okay.
Exactly. So you can always think like a lot of software has some very careful design considerations that went into it. In this case, everything inside the tag defines properties of the tag, things about the tag, and everything between tags defines the content of that tag. So we identify based on a property, and then we change based on content. And why is that? Well, think about if I tried to identify something by its content and then change that content, suddenly we don't have a stable identifier, right? So a lot of this is about design, and with smarter design, we can have smarter web pages. Okay, think I beat that horse to death. So if there's any further questions, and also let me know if you guys want to see this in real time. I have a demo set up. I'd be happy to actually do it if we're really confused.
I would like to see it in real time if possible, just to add to
Yeah,
my.
sure. Okay, let me just switch screens then. All right, so I have my example here. All right, so let's quickly define our document. So we have type, HTML, we have our HTML tag, we have our head tag, which we define as good practice, and we have our body tag. Okay, let's define a header. So H2, this is our hello world. Actually, that's confusing. We'll just call this our header. And then we have our paragraph, and that has currently, right? Let's think about this for a second. If I were to render this right now, can anyone tell me what would show up on the web page?
Just the word header?
Just the word header, right? There's no content in the paragraph tag, exactly. So let's give this an ID now. This is our demo, right? Okay. So in our script tag, we have our document object, okay? We're telling from our document object, please get the element whose ID is demo. Okay, that corresponds to this paragraph, all right? Then please fill that content with the following hello world. Okay, so
Can I ask another minor question?
of course,
Super minor, but when you're typing something, this program, gives you a little list of options. Did you mean to type this? What do you press to auto select that? Do you press enter or
tab?
like when you type in get element by ID, it shows you a different list.
Yeah, you press tab. So
okay.
tab is not only for this program, but for a wide variety of software applications. Tab corresponds to autocomplete by and large. So that's just a fun future reference. Okay, so let's render this. Give me 1 second. Let me just switch gears here. Right. So I'm assuming they showed you how to render this in Chrome. Okay, let me share this. All right, let's look at our header. We got a hello world, right? So that's a success. 1 second. Why is there? 1 second. What is that? Oh, that's why. Sorry. That should fix it. Wait, hold on. Oh, sorry. HTML, not my favorite, but you will soon see how we avoid these kinds of stupid errors and HTML idiosyncrasies. There we go. Okay. All right. Do we understand what just happened there?
Wait, why did we get the bracket?
The bracket is because I had a typo. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought that's what you meant by understand. Okay.
No. Sorry. That was me fixing my mistake.
Oh, okay.
That was my mistake.
No problem. Also, I just had a quick question that I put in the chat before. So you know how we put hello worlds because there's nothing in the p tags? If there was something in the p tags, like in between the p tags, not like in the ID space, we could still just change it by calling like document.get element, right?
Yes, and I'll go over that. Like, that is a very good point, and it's very important to what we're about to do. So I will go over that right now. Okay. Let me. There has to be a more efficient way to do this. Okay, back to this. All right, back to this. So to come back to your question, Mira, of what if there's already something there? the beauty of the object model is that it not only can change the attributes, it can also allow us to access attributes. So as we're, so if I were to, let's say, here, like, let's say I started with goodbye world in my p tag here. I can access that before I overwrite it with something else. So when you change this object, you completely overwrite what was already there. So what was there is accessible, and what can be there is writable. Does that make sense to everybody? We are quite literally changing the value of HTML. We are actually interfacing with our HTML. Like, we can access elements and their values, and we can overwrite those values. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so I'm gonna say yes. That's good. Okay. To get into a few other types of accesses, we can also access things by class name. So because multiple items can have the same class name, that's the idea of a class, it will return a list. And each list is an element for which we can change the inside HTML. We can change the content. Similarly, multiple things can have tags. We have multiple tags all the time. And so to access any particular tag, we have to index into it. We can change that content. So to kind of break down what's happening here is, the pattern is we always want to return one element for which we can change an attribute. So this is going to return a list for which we grab one element and change its content. We grab one element, get a list of tags with P, grab one element, change its content, right? Does that make sense? Okay, silence is going to have to be yes. Are lists in JavaScript indexed starting at 1? No, I believe they're 0 indexed. So if, okay, so let's go back for a few seconds. When would DOM updating it be useful? All the time. So if you only have a website that displays like static stuff, it's fine to just do vanilla HTML. But if there is anything about the content that's changing that we want to show the user, then we have to figure out a way to change HTML. HTML cannot be changed in HTML language. It's just not designed for that. It needs to be controlled by a dynamic language, a programming language. So if hello world or some other entity was already in between the p tags, we could still change it by calling document.getElement. So we need to grab the element, and then we also need to index what we want to change about it. We want to change inner HTML. So we need to do document.getElement by ID, and then also .inner HTML. So elements have multiple things that we can change, and I'll show you that in this example right now. Our list in JavaScript index starting at 1? No. Why are we starting at 1? Arbitrary choice. So for example, right, coming back to multiple things we can access. So here we have this element. Oh, sorry. We have this element, which is ID title. And we can store these objects in variables. So here we have the element whose ID is title. And then of that element, we're accessing the style attribute, not the content attribute. Sorry, not the content. we're accessing the style attribute. And even inside style, we're accessing the color attribute. So for these kinds of nested structures, we essentially need to read up on what things are accessible to us and how do we access them. So we know that HTML tags have a style attribute, and we know that they have a color attribute. So we know that in this element, we can access the style attribute, and of the styles, we can access the color attribute. So I hope it's making sense. Like, these are nested attributes of each other. A color is a type of a style, is an attribute of that tag. So we need to access all the way down to where we need to go. Content is not the only thing we can change. We don't just have to change inner HTML. We can change the style. We can change the value. We can change the class. We can change almost anything. The HTML is almost completely in our control. Does that make sense? Okay, here we are changing the CSS. Technically, yeah, you can think of it like that. Style and CSS are like the line between them is kind of a gray area, but we are essentially changing the style of the element. Could you go over again what the indexing by brackets does? Yes, so because we can have multiple elements with the same class name, this is going to return a list of all of our, sorry, one second. This is going to return a list of all of our elements. So in order to grab any particular element, we need to index into it. So 1 is just a choice here. We could have grabbed the 10th element or the 100th element or the 0th element. It's up to us for what we need to do. Okay, how do we know what attributes are available to us? For example, besides color, what other attributes are there? So that's something that we would need to look up. So based on the API that is defined for this particular file format, we would need to see what other attributes are available to us. Actually, you'll learn, I don't know how far along you guys are in your computer science journey, but the further you go, the more you realize that APIs define the way we interface with software, and being able to read them and maximize your efficiency in learning them will save you a lot of time down the road. Okay, what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. Okay, so this is actually a rather large subtopic, but essentially an API is a way for designers to communicate to users how to use the product. And APIs come in all different types of forms. If you're taking the backend track, you'll see what a REST API is. If you've ever developed with other softwares like C or C++ or Python, a lot of packages define their own APIs. So it's basically an instruction set, like an instruction manual for how to use a particular software. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, if we were to run this, it would change the items in the list. So on the previous example, if we were to run this, it would only change one of the items. It would change the content of this item. It would change the content of the second, because we're zero indexing, the second item, which has class name description. So here we get a list of elements whose class name is description. We're accessing the second item, and then we're changing the content of that item. This is different. Here, we're accessing a different element. Here we're telling the document, okay, please get the element whose ID is title. That only returns one element because IDs have to be unique. So here we get one element back, and we're telling, okay, don't change the content, just change the color to blue. So in that sense, whatever item we're accessing, we're changing a very specific set of things about it to match our needs. Does that make sense? All right, moving along then. So the window object, this is kind of like, in my opinion, not that relevant. So I'm going to go kind of quickly. But basically the window object defines the browser that you're in. So it can do top level things like open a window, resize a window. It's the topmost element because it's the biggest render, right? We render the browser first, the window first, and then we can render all the things inside of it. Yeah, in my opinion, that's not much more important than that. And you really don't need to know it. So I'm just going to keep going. Okay, events. So when we change things in HTML, either they can be triggered automatically by some script on the back end, like let's say if we want to do it at a certain time or something like that, or HTML and JavaScript together give us the ability to trigger events when we do something. So that something can be a lot of different things. It can be clicking a button. It can be hovering over an item. It can be scrolling. It can be changing the window size. It can be a ton of different things. And basically, it's something that happens on the user side, and we take in that input, and we can respond to it. So let's think about for a second, right? Let's say I click my mouse and the slide changes, or I click the back arrow and the slide changes. So essentially what's happening is on the back end of this website, there's JavaScript code that says, when the user clicks a mouse, please execute this function. Or when a user clicks a button, please execute this function. And essentially, we can add what's called a listener to any tag. When we add a listener to a tag, it basically says, okay, if this particular type of event happens to this tag, please execute the associated function. And I'll go over that in more detail of how we actually write all of this down. But essentially, we assign a tag to be listened to by our code so that whenever something happens, our listener knows to trigger a function. Okay, that's kind of a top level overview. Are there any questions? Okay, sorry. I don't see any questions. Oh, okay, is an event an object? Yes, an event is an object. So the event that triggers has event attributes, and we can access those attributes. The primary one is here on this slide, event.target. Event.target is basically when an event is triggered, event.target is the address of the node from which the event was triggered. So for example, if I click a button and it triggers an event, event.target is the button that was clicked. And that is very important. Knowing where an event came from helps us to decode what we want that event to do. It helps us to write flexible and efficient code without losing information in the meantime. And again, I'll go more into detail about that. Okay. So these are event handlers. So hold on a second. Essentially, here's what we do. We say, okay, here we have a button. This is an object, this is an element, right? And we're saying, okay, document, please get the element whose ID is button. That's this tag. To that event, please add a listener, which listens for a click. And when that click is triggered, please run this function. Okay, let's go over that one more time. So we grabbed an element, we grabbed this element. When this element is clicked, it runs this function. We're basically telling JavaScript, please listen for this event on this element and trigger this function when you hear that event. Does that make sense broadly? Okay. So back to our previous conversation. Here, event is an object. So when we run this function, basically this listener will pass the event object to this function as a parameter. And so we can access that parameter as an object. So we're saying, okay, for the function that we get passed, please access the target. So that's, remember, that's the element from which was triggered. Please access this attribute of the target. Please access the inner text. So does anyone want to take a guess what would happen if I ran this? Anyone? Button 1. Yes, correct. Attendance, I will send out shortly. Yes, pop-up, that's good. Yes, a pop-up saying that you clicked on button 1. What time is it? 7:20? Does anyone want to see this in real time, or do you want to move on?
Can we see a demo of this?
Yeah, of course. Okay, let me go back to our HTML page. Okay, so, alrighty. Oh, sorry, wrong thing. Oh no, hold on a second. Sorry. Why is this broken? Can you guys see anything? Okay, there we go. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I am going to, actually, I'm going to demonstrate that this can be done on any object. So here I'm going to put my name. Okay, and then here I'm going to put, okay, so we want to grab this element. All right, so we're saying document, please grab this element. Yes. And then to this element, please add an event listener where when I click on the element, I execute the following function. I execute the following function on event E. I want to alert actually, we're going to first grab our so I'm going to grab my inner text, my content from this element, and I'm going to assign that to a variable. So I'm going to assign that to text. Okay, and then I'm going to alert hello me. Right, okay, so let's try running this. Does this make sense to everybody? So the point I'm trying to make here is that we can attach a listener to any element. It does not have to be a button. Basically, when this event is triggered on any element I choose, this function will execute. Okay, so let's look at this. Go back, go to my index.html page. And all right, I see my name. Okay, can you guys see this? Can you guys see this HTML page?
Yes.
Okay, let me click my name now. Okay, can you see the pop-up?
I don't think we saw the pop-up.
Okay, that's probably because pop-ups don't render on
Oh.
the Zoom thing, but I assure you it did pop up. It did pop up. Okay, well let's try a different example then. Let's do this. Let's say, okay, instead we'll grab the header. Let's do assign this to an ID. Okay, we're gonna grab that ID. We're gonna say to the inside, please set that equal to the text. Okay, let's look at what that does. All right, so what do we theorize will happen here? Sorry, you're gonna have to speak because my thing is gone. Okay, well, you can probably guess what happens here. It changed as I told it to. Okay, that was a lot. Are there any questions of what happened here? Please feel free to put it in the chat.
Just instead of document.getElementById demo.innerText, we could have used like the event.target.
Yes, we could have. Actually, yeah, let's do that. So here, right, it makes sense that we know what the target is because I set the target, right? But we won't always know. That's a very good point. So instead, let's do text event.target.inner HTML. We can do inner text or inner HTML. Let's do inner text. Hello, why is this not? It's fine. Okay, if we go back to our index.html, refresh this. Make sure you guys are refreshing your pages in between. I found that was often the reason nothing worked. Okay, so that does the same thing. That's a very good point. Okay, are there any questions? For the last example, did you use backticks instead of quotation marks? Yes. In order to do string formatting in JavaScript, you need to use backticks instead of quotation marks. Okay, are there any other questions?
I have a quick question. What gets passed into the E parameter is it the string click?
What it gets passed to the event parameter? Is that what you said?
Yeah, in the function you wrote. Like if you go back to your
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just show the slides. So this parameter could be anything, right? I could call this event. I could call this E. I could call this anything, right?
And click get passed into it?
Yeah. So
okay.
The function, when it executes, right? This parent function will run this anonymous function by passing the event into it. So it's up to me what I want to name the event, but it's accessible in any way, right? It's just a parameter which I defined. So I can put anything here. I can put E, you can put hello, whatever. It's whatever you please.
Yeah, I understand that we can change the name of the parameter, but what finally get passed into, like what gets replaced by hello is click, right? It's like the event.
It's the event object. So this event.target is a different type of object that specifically passes the element from which the event was triggered. So this event was triggered by this element, right? So event.target will call back to this element. And then it's just the same as if I had put document.getID element by ID. It's the same object, but accessed specifically by event.target. And the advantage of that is that I can add, like, for example, like let's say I defined this function outside, right? Let's say I didn't put it here. Let's say I wanted to make a general function, like, okay, this is wrong because obviously it's outside of the HTML, but let's say I just wanted to say event, please alert the event.target.inner HTML, right? Let's say I define it outside of my function and I want to then pass it to this function. In that case, if I were to hard code, like if I were to hard code, oh my God, sorry. Hold on, I'm a little rusty at JavaScript.
There should be a function name.
Yeah. Okay, so if I were to hard code this, right? If I were to hard code this, and let's say I add a listener. Let's say I add a listener to the header now. And I pass this same function. So here I can just pass example as a pure function, right? You see how here it will return my name, and here it will return header. That's why I can't hard code document.get. If I hard code document.get, it will always call to the document element that I define. But here, if I call it by event, then it will always pop up with the event from which I defined it. Does that make sense? That's kind of confusing, I know.
I see. So basically, the event is an object that groups together what element calls the event and the like action click.
So the first parameter is just telling this listener. Sorry, I misunderstood your question. This first parameter is just telling what kind of event to listen to. So there are other events which we can encode, like hover or drag or scroll or whatever. But we're telling it, please add a listener for the click event type. And then on click, please run this function. We could also do, I'm not really familiar with the other types because we don't use them as much, but we could also do like on hover or on this or on that. So click is the type of event that we're listening for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much.
So is E working as a function? Also, what does the var text work as? E is an object which packages together all of the attributes and metadata we need to know about the event. And var text in the previous example was just a way to save a particular piece of information instead of writing it. So here I could say like var text is equal to event.target.inner HTML, and then I could put text here. Or as you'll see, we can just say the element is the event target. Please access the element inner HTML or inner text or whatever. So it's just a way to break up our code into cleaner, reusable parts. Okay, the second parameter we're passing into add event listener. Is it either just the name of the function or is it the definition of the entire function? It is technically speaking, a pointer to a function object. So it is the name of a function which the program can run later. So most people use anonymous functions, which is what I used earlier, but it can also just be the name of a function I defined earlier. It just has to be the name of a function which can be called. This is kind of out of scope for this class. Out of scope in the sense that it's a much deeper thing than that, because we have to like higher order functions, and functions as objects are principles of CS61A. But essentially we can pass any function in here, any function definition, or any name of a function that points to a function definition. Does that make sense? Okay, excellent. All right, I'm going to jump back to the presentation now. All right, back to the presentation. All right, so like I said earlier, we have a lot of different types. So on click, on change, on mouse over, those can all be passed as the first parameter to event listener. Or we can either add a listener from JavaScript, or we can define a function as an attribute of our tag. So for example, a button has an on-click attribute that defines a function that will run. So a button doesn't need an event listener. It has a built-in event listener. And to that event listener, all we need to do is assign a function. That is probably pretty confusing. But if you look at this example here, right, you see how this is now an attribute inside of a tag, which calls to a function, right? That's basically saying, okay, on click, which is a built-in event listener. This is a special thing. On click, please execute this function. Okay, does that make sense? Are there any questions about that?
Can I have a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
In the second picture of on this page, I noticed that when you call my function, there's no parameter passed into the function, but in the body of the function, you still refer to event.target. So is it like implicitly passed into the function?
Yeah, actually, I think this is a mistake. I believe that it should just be the name of the function. I don't think you need the parentheses. Like I said earlier, it should be the name of a function which can be called by the built-in JavaScript. So we don't actually want to call the function prematurely. That will not do what you want. You want to pass the name of a function or an anonymous function, which can be called later. So I will go back and fix these slides. I'll check and send a Slack announcement about it, okay? But if I'm correct, then there should not be parentheses here. Sorry, that's kind of confusing, I know. So I'll look into that and get back to you. Okay, any other questions? Okay, let's move on then. So event bubbling. So event bubbling is basically the idea that if we assign a listener at the top level of an element, and that element has elements inside of it, right? Theoretically, because the elements are inside that top level element, technically an event did fire inside that element. So technically we should be firing that event. But we also want some sense of specificity. So let's say I define an event for body, and then I define an event for this div, and then I define an event for this button. Essentially, what JavaScript will do is if each of these have listeners, it will execute it from the bottom up. So it will execute the button listener, then the div listener, then the body listener, and then any other listeners that are nested above it. So if you have listeners nested inside of each other, it's important to realize that they will all fire eventually. There's no way to stop it from propagating upwards. So with a smarter design, you can avoid the kind of errors that would come from that of like, let's say you add a listener to a div, and then inside that div is a button, and you only want it to fire the div to fire on a certain event, but not every time the button is clicked. You can't stop that from happening. So instead you have to define a new element and delegate it to that function. Okay, does that make sense?
So what's the alternative you proposed? Define what?
So there's a lot of different things you can do, and I just made up an example, but basically like with smarter design. So like, let's say you want your button, like let's say you have a div with a button inside, and you want the div to do something every time the button fires, but let's say you have multiple buttons. So if we had an on click at the div level, then it would fire every single time each of those buttons was clicked. Instead, it's smarter to keep our function specific to the one button. Only add listeners to the button, not to the div, because the div one will fire on every button.
Makes
So
sense.
it's about keeping specificity while maintaining generalizability. Does that make sense? I know that's kind of confusing, but
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah. All right, let's move on. Okay. I'll give you 2 minutes to look at this. Actually, let's just do 30 seconds to look at this. Please put in the chat your thoughts. And I will also send out, oh, sorry, the screen sharing paused.
Did you release the attendance lake or no?
No, that's what I'm about to do. Just give me 1 second. I just have to exit out of this really quickly. Actually, no. Okay, I have an option. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Today's magic word is Dominion. Don't ask why. I don't have a good reason. Okay. Okay, what do we think? Please put in the chat. What do we think? So you can just put the letter. Oh, sorry. 1 second. Let's open this for responses. How do you, Alex, turn this off? 1 second. If anyone knows how to turn this on for responses, I don't remember. Oh, I would be very grateful. Oh, no, how do you? Does anyone know? Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. Should be good now. Okay, so this answer, I'll just give it away. Whatever, it's fine. Okay, so A. So why is it A? So if we look here carefully, we have our div with an ID and our paragraph with an ID. So let's go through the script tag here. So here, drink is the element whose ID is drink. So that's this paragraph here. To drink, we add a listener waiting for a click. And on that click, we have a function. And that function says to this element, this has a mistake. There should be a line in here about var adiv is equal to document.getElement by ID adiv. We need to access that element. Sorry, that is wrong. I will fix that and send an update later. But sorry, that probably made this really confusing. But basically it's saying, let's say this was drink. It would say drink to the drink style, change the background to aquamarine. Then drink, add event listener, add toppings. Add toppings is not defined. So it would not work. That would not work. I don't know. Sorry, these are not my slides, but they're full of mistakes. So I apologize for that.
If
oh, sorry, it is
topping,
defined. It is defined. Sorry, it is defined. But this one is a mistake. Adiv should be defined as document.getElement by ID adiv. So add toppings, that would call this function. So to this element here, change the inner HTML to whatever it was, plus with putting in boba. So black sugar milk tea with putting in boba. Okay, does anyone have any questions about that example? Okay, let's go to another example. Okay, let's try this one. Any ideas?
so here we should also assume that adiv is defined, or like we replace adiv by
yeah,
drink.
just assume adiv is defined by document.getElement by ID adiv. Just assume adiv corresponds to this element here. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's a mistake. Okay, this one's actually a bit of a trick question, but it's really important that you understand why it's a trick question. So here, right? Oh, wait, no. I don't know if I like this example. You know what? No, I don't like this example. Sorry, guys. This is not worth it. Let's move on to the big demo. Okay, so we have 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to make this speedy. Basically, all right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a simple thing where we can make lists out of objects. So we have, we're going to call this grouper, and we're going to say it's by me. Okay. And So I'm going to delete this, right? Or delete this. And then okay, I'm going to do it to my index.js file, which I have defined already. Okay, so basically my goal is to make a website that will take in a list of items and list those things for me. So I'm going to define an index with type text where I can put my items. And I'm going to define a button that will be my submit button. So we're going to call this input. And I'm going to have my list. Okay, sorry. Okay, so all right. So let's take a look at the JavaScript for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to show you guys some of the ways in which we can streamline our goals. So I'm going to define first the elements with which we'll be interfacing. So we have our input. Right? We have our submit button. We have our list, right? Okay, let's do this. So to my submit button, I'm going to add a listener, right? I want to know when people are clicking submit. So we're going to have submit dot add event listener. We're going to listen for a click, and then on the click, we are going to call a function. Now, what do we want this function to do? So first, we want to grab the value that we've inputted to our text input. So I'm going to say input dot, or I'm going to say let text equal to my input text. So we actually index this by value because it's an input. You don't need to know that until later, but just trust me. Stop it. Okay. Then we are going to create a new element. So I'm going to say, let my new list item be dot a new list item. And then that item should contain my text. And then to my list, I'm going to append a new child, which is that item. And that should be it. So let's test this out. I know that was really, really quick, but we're running out of time. All right, index.html. I'm gonna hide our floating media control. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Submit. Okay, let's see if this works. So let's do grocery list. So groceries, we're gonna need apples, right? Okay, we got apples. We're gonna need oranges. We got oranges. We're gonna need bananas. We got bananas. We're gonna need cake because who doesn't need cake? So that is a very bare bones example of what is doable with just pure HTML and JavaScript. Okay, that was a lot. So we have like 7 minutes, and I'm going to reserve it all for questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Does it matter where the function is placed? No. JavaScript, the way it works, it will read in all your functions before executing your code. Will all this code be available? Yes, I will try to make it available. Can you show the code again? Yes, I can. Okay. All right. So we have our index.html, and we have our, how can I, okay, this is going to be kind of irritating. See if I can split screen this. Okay, index and our HTML. Okay. Questions?
I have a quick question. When we wanted to attach a CSS file to our HTML index, we would put it like usually or in the head or like in the head tags, like between the head tags or at the beginning of body. But for the JavaScript, should we always put it at the end of body, or can we also put it in the between the head tags?
So the way it works, because script tags are actually calling JavaScript functions in real time, we put it in the body traditionally. I think there is a way to put it in the head, but it's a little bit confusing. Yeah, to keep it simple, and that's our goal always. Just put it at the end of the body.
Okay, so the classic way of designing the website would be to end with the script tag just
That's
before
correct.
the body.
That's
Okay.
correct. One or multiple script tags. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question, but not really related to the lecture, but like turning in homework. Can I ask now? Or
Yes, I can try to answer.
okay, I'm trying to add my homework 2 file, but it's not letting me. At first it did, and then now it's not, and I don't really know what's happening. Like when I try to let me see, it says when I add it and I use get status, it like doesn't add that file, I guess.
So did you actually make changes to your file?
I think I did. I mean, I like, it's not in my repository and GitHub. I just have homework 1 and I don't know how to add homework 2, so I can get like the link.
Oh, I see. When you run get status, do you see your homework 2 file under the modified or created tags? The not staged for commit?
No.
So that's the problem, is that your Git repository is not recognizing your file. So make sure that number 1, your homework file is actually in the correct directory, like inside the Git repository directory, like where Git is initialized. And then try going to the top level of that directory, like the very top level in which Git actually exists, and then try adding it again.
I don't have anything related to homework 2. It's like telling me to add everything else. And like it's telling me to add homework 1 again, but I already have homework 1 in there, so I don't really know why.
Okay, I can have you share screen. Just give me a second.
Okay.